2 days before the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight, all right, we get a funny email from one of our investors. They're like, hey, there's a trainer that, is working with the Jake Paul fight, and he's interested basically in a sponsorship. I'll never forget this. Basically, there was a cut between, in between the different rounds, and the trainer comes in. The trainer, Jay Leon, he leaned down, and the camera was just live streaming Make America Healthy Again Nucleus. That was a defining moment for me, because it says, well, if you can put your hat, on the Jake Paul fight and, whatever, tens of millions of people can see it, what else can you do?
This is Kian Sadeghi, founder and CEO of Nucleus Genomics, a company using whole genome sequencing and AI to help people understand their health and genetic risks. In his leadership, Nucleus has raised over $32 million from investors like Founders Fund and 776.
Fundraising is definitely an art. You raise money via emotion principally, and understanding that investors really, by and large, they don't really have a good sense of anything, okay? They just don't.
You mentioned that if you are a founder, you're competing with Mr. Beast. Can you elaborate on that?
One time one of our investors, he said to me, the only thing that matters for a consumer startup is...
Let's speak a bit about the lean startup versus the moonshot. How are you thinking about these things, and how should people think about it?
I think if you're a founder starting out, this is king.
Okay, guys, how was the workout? Nice. So, guys, Kian promised that at the end of this interview, he's going to run and do the cold plunge. So stay until that.
I will do the cold plunge after this, yes. I mean, I'm not really in the right clothes, but I'll do it.
So let's start with the first question. Kian dropped out of school. So is it a requirement to start a big business to drop out of school?
Classic question. No, I don't think so. I think ultimately building a startup is following your bliss, right? So your inner being, I like to say, matches the physical plane. It's like a greater calling. And whether it's a college dropout, whether it's graduate, whether you're 40 years old or not, if you follow that intuition of yours, if you follow that bliss, I don't think it really matters whether you're a college dropout or not. I think the college dropout thing is all probably overblown as well in general for a lot of reasons. So that's my perspective.
Okay. And also, we did a podcast before, and you mentioned in the podcast, since there's a lot of people that are going to join the AI event of YC, you said that if you start an AI company after you heard about ChatGPT, you're not going to make it. Can you elaborate?
He's getting me with the quotes. This is like a journalist, what they do. They find something I say and then ask me about it. I think that generally speaking, probably what's happening here with AI is it's probably like, the internet in the early 2000s. There's probably some sort of exceptional gold rush going on, and people have to capitalize in some shape or form. I'm always a little bit skeptical if people start an AI company if they didn't know what AI was. I don't think it's like a bad thing per se. I think it's probably on average a bad thing. But again, startups really aren't about averages. I wonder whether I was talking to one of my friends who runs a pretty large company, and he was saying how what they were doing is they were serving like a bunch of businesses and basically a bunch of restaurants, and through the advent of ChatGPT and, AI, basically it completely accelerated what already was an existing product market fit. And there's almost like this two kind of schools of thought right now in Silicon Valley. One school of thought is about this idea of, okay, AI is going to predominantly help the incumbents. The other one is actually like everything is going to be rewritten. I think probably whenever there's two models that are competing against each other, both are true. Because I do see AI helping existing companies that have been running for, 4 or 5 years and just absolutely propelling them to another stage. Not exactly, kind of incumbents, but kind of later onset startups. And then I also see the parallel side where you see startups cropping up now, getting an insane amount of run rate, insane amount of revenue and traction that are kind of quote unquote AI native. And so I see both of these things playing out and probably some combination of in between. I wonder also whether with AI sometimes it takes almost a couple years before you can actually really understand and realize the promise of AI. Like if you just throw your hat in the ring now, is it too soon? It's still kind of muddled. There's too much there's just so much noise. It's hard to know.
And before I even start about Nucleus, how many of you guys saw the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight? Raise of hands. Did you see the logo placement of Nucleus on the cap?
Thank you, brother.
Yeah? So it was that scene that in the biggest fight of the year, Nucleus had their logo into the middle of the stage. So how the fuck did you make this?
that is still one of my favorite stories of all time. So what happened was that basically 2 days before the Jake Paul Mike Tyson fight, all right, we get a funny email from one of our investors. They're like, hey, there's a trainer that is working with the Jake Paul fight, and he's interested basically in a sponsorship. And I thought, we're never ever going to spend a couple $1 million on some random boxing fight. But there was a weird thing that happened where, because of like the time pressure of the event, it was in 2 days, and because of the nature of the deal, we could basically bring down the price dramatically. And the deal was very simple: was we're going to give him a hat to wear with a Nucleus logo. And of course, never in my wildest dreams did I think that if I gave a hat. So what happened was that we had a couple of VIP tickets. We were on the boxing floor, and I remember that we had to smuggle in a bunch of Nucleus gear and a bunch of Nucleus DNA kits, right? And so we go there, and I remember telling the security guard, I was like, oh, we're like a sponsor. And they're like, oh, you're a nonprofit, right? I was like, yeah, we're a nonprofit. Well, I don't know. We walked right on in with the bags. The security was not good. And we're on the floor walking around, and I remember I walked right to where the Jake Paul team was. And, of course, I pretended to say hi to some of the team. I didn't really know them. I was like, oh, hey. They're like, oh, hey. Something about when you're in the ringside, they just assume that you're supposed to be there. It's a really funny phenomenon. Anyways, and so then, the Jake Paul team starts coming out, and I see one of the trainers actually in the hat with the Nucleus logo, and it says, Make America Healthy Again. And of course, we knew, Make America Healthy Again was going to be a provocative kind of message. What I told the team internally was that you almost want to put a flea, which is Nucleus, on the backs of an invasive species, right? The invasive species is Make America Healthy Again, and then the flea was Nucleus. Because I knew if you put a Nucleus logo, no one's going to remember that. No one has affiliation with the brand. And so what happened is he's wearing this Make America Healthy Again hat, and I'll never forget this. Basically, there was a cut between, in between the different rounds, and the trainer comes in, and basically Netflix, which was a sponsor of it, they I don't know, I feel like it was almost staged. The trainer, Jay Leon, he leaned down, and the camera was just live streaming Make America Healthy Again Nucleus. And I remember this. I was sitting on the side, and I looked up at the big screen, and I saw Nucleus, the logo, in the big screen in this arena, and I'm thinking to myself, it was almost like this mind-bending reality moment, right? Because I literally, sometimes, have you ever seen Stranger Things, where the character kind of gets lost and goes to the other world, right? I felt like I went to that. I went to the other world. I saw myself, 5 years ago in my bedroom, dropped out of college, thinking, is this thing ever going to work? And I could see the level of intensity and focus, and how much the creation from my mind, right? Because before an idea comes to life, before it enters the physical plane, it exists in the intellectual plane. And so to see kind of Nucleus kind of as a theory from 5 years ago, suddenly at the largest event of the year on the big screen there, that was one of the greatest, I think, just intoxicating moments, because you realize intuitively, you realize experientially that you can basically bend reality to your will. And that's very powerful. And I think that was a defining moment for me, because it says, well, if you can put your hat, on the Jake Paul fight, and, whatever, tens of millions of people can see it, what else can you do? And you start realizing, not as an intellectual concept, but experientially, intuitively, that you can just shape and mold the world around you. And I think that, on Twitter, I think it probably got 50 million plus impressions, because exactly what we wanted to happen, where people would take a picture of it. They would say, look, Jay Leon's, Make America Healthy Again. And then it would say Nucleus. Not bad.
And let's go a few years earlier. What's the prehistory? How did you start? And then I remember that you texted your first investor to receive the first investment. Can you walk us through the idea generation? How did you think about it? Why did you decide to drop out of school? And how did you raise your first money?
Yeah, so I'm a first-generation American. Both my parents are Persian. I'm sure. How many of you guys are immigrants or first-gen? Put your hand up. Wow, that's crazy, disproportionate. Makes sense, right? So I'm a first-generation American. My dad has sort of this proverbial immigrant story. He was kicked out of Iran because, well, he spoke badly against the government. They tried to murder him. He ended up in America. He was flipping hamburgers in McDonald's, literally, and eventually became an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor. And so I think I was sort of born with the determination of immigrant parents, with the opportunity of America. I grew up in Brooklyn. And when I was almost 7 years old, my cousin, she unfortunately went to sleep and she died. And, at the time, I asked my parents, how does this happen? How does this happen? And they just said, oh, bad genetics. And it just didn't make sense. It just didn't make sense to me. And so I eventually started studying genetics. And what I realized was that disease isn't really like an inherent property of human beings. It can be viewed more as a problem to be solved. And I think that logic came from the fact that there were other 15-year-olds who were not my cousin that were alive. So it just seemed sort of like an arbitrary thing that someone dies and someone doesn't. And so eventually I started doing genetic engineering work, actually. So my initial foray into genetics was actually engineering different organisms. So I joined this do-it-yourself gene editing laboratory in the second floor of a warehouse in Brooklyn. And there, we engineered yeast to make them illuminate. We edited bacteria to make them resistant to antibiotics. This is like 2017. And I loved the wet lab, but the problem with the wet lab is it wasn't very iterable. But the computer was iterable. In the wet lab, if you make a mistake, forget about it. You have to do the whole experiment again. It takes a couple of weeks. On the computer, when you make a mistake, you just click the delete button. So I kind of like that iterability. So I wanted to work at that intersection of, bits and atoms. And so eventually I went to Penn to study computational biology. And I was there for about a year and a half until literally I was in a genetics class, Bio 221. And the chairman of the biology department brought up what is, my favorite chart in the world, which shows the decrease in cost of sequencing a human genome. So if you think of your DNA as like a 1,000-page book, it used to be $1 billion to read all 1,000 pages, right? And then in 2020, at the time, it was about $1,000. And I thought to myself, well, obviously this price, if it's going from $1 billion to $1,000, is going to converge on basically negligible price. Obviously, there's going to be a rapid exponential proliferation in this data. Someone's going to have to build the application layer for DNA. And so I dropped out. I moved back into my bedroom in Brooklyn. Let's just say my parents were not enthused. So I lied to them. Sorry, mom and dad. I told them I was working in a professor's laboratory. No professor's laboratory. And I got to work. I filled in 18 subject notebooks. I was basically like fanatically obsessed with this problem for a year. And I eventually remember I was like, wait a second, I can build software that provides the most comprehensive assessment of someone's genetic risk for diseases and traits that's ever been available. And I remember I told my parents this and they said to me, okay, well, we're going to kick you out of the home. Uh-oh, that's not good. And so what I did was I found, so there was a program. So who here knows what Z Fellows is? Not surprising, a lot. See, look. So there was a program that actually just predicated Z Fellows. It was called First Text. Who knows what First Text is? Wow, a couple of people actually do. That's pretty cool. So First Text, shout out to Corey. He had his phone number online on a web page. And so I figured, okay, well, let me text his phone number. And so I said, hi, my name's Kian.
Wait. So you had his phone number online and you could text him?
He had his phone number online. And so it literally was firsttext.com. I'm not sure.
How much spam is this guy getting?
Oh, he would get a lot of spam, but he had two phones, I found out.
Okay.
So it's kind of like that's how he bifurcated it. And so Corey, hi, my name's Kian, whatever, I'm building this company. That's probably, what I sounded like. And then I remember he took 2 weeks to respond. I'm like, these damn investors, fake as mother. These damn investors are spineless. They're fake. I remember, this stuff. And then I'm like frustrated. Then he's like, oh, hey, yeah, let's talk later today. I'm like, classic. They come out, then they talk, let's talk today, okay, whatever. And so then I'm in my Android phone, okay? And I remember I go on a walk and I'm waiting for his call. He never calls me. Doesn't call me. And I'm like, these people, man, like, what the hell? Why is it like, what, you would think you're building something, they don't care. And then I remember I went back home. He said, oh, I'm so sorry. I have two phones. Who the fuck has two phones? And he's like, okay, let's call right now. So I go to the basement. I see my brother in the basement. I'm like, Kamyar, his name's Kamyar. I'm like, Kamyar, get out of here. And he's like, what? I'm like, get out of here. So I kick him out of the basement and then I'm on the phone with him. And all I remember is, 45 minutes. I go, nucleus is silence. Just rip, because it's like a year worth of buildup of like emotions, of like statistics and all these things. And he goes, so it's a better 23andMe? I said, yeah, I should have started there. Okay, God damn it. Yes, it's a better 23andMe. He said, okay, then let me talk to my business partner and I'll get back to you. And then we do one more phone call. And then I remember maybe 10 hours later, it's a rainy day in Brooklyn. I'm in my bedroom. I'm doing work. And then I get a text. I check my phone and it says, we want to give you $200,000. And I was euphoric. I was literally genuinely euphoric.
So the guy never met you in real life?
No. And it's unusual. Well, yeah, no, he didn't. But it's unusual because it was COVID during the time too. Like even Founders Fund, which we can talk about next, they almost never will invest if they don't meet. I think Z Fellows does a little bit differently, as a general rule.
Okay. Speaking of Founders Fund, you also raised from Founders Funds. It's considered the best fund in the world. Can you tell us the story?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that's interesting, and this applies, I was talking to someone who said he's looking to raise money for his startup. Fundraising is definitely an art, right? So, sometimes people ask, like, how do you raise money? How do you raise money? How do you raise money? You raise money via emotion principally, and understanding that investors really, by and large, they don't really have a good sense of anything. Okay. They just don't. You have to teach them. You have to show them. You have to tell a very compelling narrative that,
By the way, there are some friend investors here. You can guys maybe close your ears for a bit.
sorry, investors. You have to tell a very compelling story, because let me give an example of Nucleus, right? Now people, like, I think generally in the kind of investor Silicon Valley community, embrace Nucleus quite a bit. That was definitely not the case in the seed round. In the seed round, we pitched 40 investors. They all said no, all of them. And so imagine now, I've been working this for a year and a half. You have $200,000. You dropped out of school. Every investor when you're beginning your kind of Silicon Valley journey, you're kind of like, oh, these people must know. They all think it's a terrible idea. And the last firm we were pitching was actually Founders Fund. And I mean,
The last one.
yeah, which is kind of crazy. And I remember that, there's actually a lot of good lessons here, which is, one good lesson is that, especially if you're doing a seed round and you're new, you should always have a quarterback to your financing. So you should find basically someone who's already an entrenched member of the community, and then who believes in you, and use them as the person that sort of, quarterbacks your entire round. That's a good piece of kind of seed financing advice, primarily because the person who introduces you to the investor, I would argue, is just as important as your pitch, because ultimately investors will determine to invest by calling their buddies, right? That's ultimately what they're doing. So they're kind of getting a vibe check, because they all know each other. So be careful if you're telling one investor something, because you're telling all of Silicon Valley, right? So get the quarterback in the round, and then you have to get a successful financing done, you have to line up a lot of things. One is you have to have this quarterback. Two is you have to have a very compelling narrative. The narrative should be something about how, and ideally it is actually this, how the thing you're building is the culmination of your life's work in some respect, right? And the thing is that authenticity is hard to fake, right? If it's real, everyone feels it. So remember that. So you have the quarterback, you have this, and then you have an investor that's already primed. Let me talk a little bit more about the last one. So I get introduced to Keith, who's now at Coastal Ventures, by the time he's at Founders Fund. And I get on the phone with him, and I never forget this, because I always felt as if when I was telling the story, I had to give the investor so much context to understand why is it meaningful, right? And so something I'd always say in the pitch is I would say, there's an amazing decrease in cost of sequencing the genome. It's one of the most profound technological shifts ever, right? And I would show the chart and say it's $1 billion. Now it's, $1,000. I remember Keith, he said, yeah, I already know that. I said, what? That's the first investor that said that. Think about that. These are Silicon Valley investors. The first investor that said, I already knew that. And then he said, yeah, I gave a company, $300 million to actually keep bringing down the cost. So now he knows it and he's investing in it. And I said, what? What company? Oh, it's confidential. Who are you? I'm not going to tell you. I said, okay, don't tell me. And so what I did was I found a patent. It's actually a true story. It's a crazy story. I found a patent of the founder of this company that was under stealth. His name is Gilad, and it was a patent for a sequencing technology. And I figured, well, how many people are issuing patents for sequencing technology? It must be this guy. And on his LinkedIn, it just said stealth. And he was sort of this guy that I think he's a Caltech PhD. He had sold a couple companies, and I was like, okay, it must be this. And so I actually text him and I say, I say, hey, I'm good friends with Keith. I was not good friends with Keith. And I said, hey, I would love to get up on the phone today. I'm building a analysis company. And he says, okay, sure. You're good friends with Keith? You sure, and then we literally, and God bless Gilad for this, we get on the phone. It's a Saturday. We get on the phone and I start pitching him, and he says, this is an amazing idea. And then he says, where do you have your PhD from? I said, no PhD. So, okay. Then he says, you must have raised at this point, tens of millions of dollars. I said, 200,000. He says, what the hell? How is no one invested in this? I said, you tell me. And then supposedly he actually went and called Keith then and said, hey, you have to invest in this company. And then on Monday I spoke to Delian, who's another partner at Founders Fund. And then in 5 minutes, Delian said, we want to put in, $1.5 million. And so the thing there to remember, the lesson to take from that in the seed round is there is this delicate mix of, I think, persistence, shamelessness, but also good luck. Things have to think. But the lesson I would take from this is that, Keith and Founders Fund more broadly is primed in that respect, right? You have to sometimes people say to me, oh, I pitched 60 firms this week. I don't care. the 59 of those firms are not even a good fit for this business. You need to find the right GP at the right fund, and then you need to do anything and everything in your capacity to close that person. You need to go scorched earth to get them over the line. That's what you have to do. And so I think Founders was a good example of that, because they adopt the ethos not only of their kind of contrarianism, but they did not just involved in the sense of they know intellectually about the decrease in costs. They knew experientially that, okay, the cost of sequencing is going to keep coming down because they were the ones investing in it. And so you start seeing that he was primed. So when I came to him, then you have the founder investor fit, right? Founders fund, they like their dropouts. You have the founder investor fit. You have the kind of market ideological fit. And then you have the fact they're just like primed. And then you push them over the edge. And so Founders Fund came in. And then a couple months after that, you had Alexis Ohanian, a brilliant investor, amazing man, just so smart. He came in and then put in another, I think, $15 million. That was a couple of years ago at this point. And so that's sort of our financing story, because I know a lot of people are going to be interested in financing specifically. That's our story.
If we go back to the whole genome test, and why does it matter? How is this different than the traditional testing from the likes of what 23andMe is doing or Ancestry?
Great question. So when 23andMe got started in 2006, the cost of reading all 1,000 pages of your DNA was about $10 million per sample. Okay, so it was way, way, way too expensive to possibly actually bring what's called this whole genome test to market. So instead, they use a technology called microarray. Basically, what microarray does is look at a small sliver of your DNA. So if your DNA is a 1,000-page book, 23andMe looked at 1 page out of 1,000. Okay. And so what happened over time, though, is in 2006, it was $10 million, but then suddenly it became $1,000. And so why would you read 1 page of your DNA, right, for whatever, $200 when you can read all 1,000 pages, right? And what's the difference here? Well, the way you should think about the genetic testing market is it really today sequesters into 5 separate industries. The first is disease risk assessment, right? So, for example, you might know about Angelina Jolie. She had a breast cancer marker that dramatically increased her risk of breast cancer, right? So that's a company that does myriad genetics, it's called. They do hereditary cancer screening. So it's one kind of genetic test. Then there's like genealogy, like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, a little bit more gimmicky, a little bit more kind of consumer, does my pea smell like asparagus? And then there's another market for preconception testing, which is genetic testing for seeing if you and your partner are a match. In other words, if you're at risk of passing down a serious genetic condition to your children. Yet another company, yet another industry, another application. There's pharmacogenomics, how your DNA affects your metabolism on different drugs, another application, genetics. And then there's, of course, the one that we're most notorious for now, I guess, IVF testing, right? Analyzing embryos. So each of these, if you think about it, became disparate industries. Why? They became disparate industries fundamentally because if you're going to do a breast cancer test, the underlying assumption is that you couldn't read enough of the DNA to then also do a, heart disease test, to also do a preconception test, to also do whatever pharmacogenomics, which is how your DNA affects the metabolism of drugs test. In other words, there were 70,000 different genetic tests that each looked at a different page in your DNA. But now, through the fact that the whole genome sequencing is sufficient and cheap enough, you can combine these 70,000 genetic tests into just one. So what you're really doing here is you're combining every possible application of genetics into a single lab test. And so it's disruptive in every sense. And another thing that I think we did, which was unique, is that we realized this as a computational problem, not as a wet laboratory problem. If you think about it, if you build an application layer for DNA, it doesn't actually matter where the raw DNA, because what happens is the DNA, it's in atoms, and we translate it from atoms into bits, right? You collect your swab, it goes on a machine, the machine reads the DNA, it enters the cloud. You can almost think of it as like literally a text file, right? We take this text file, complicated text file, and you analyze it. And from that perspective, you realize that the actual application layer of DNA is decoupled from the lab testing. So it actually doesn't matter who or what does the lab testing. And that with that realization as well, we realized, wait a second, if we build this application layer, we can do some testing, sure, and we do some testing, but really actually doesn't matter who does the testing. Anyone who does any genetic testing is going to end up in Nucleus's hands because we simply have the best application layer in the world. And so this is the kind of uniqueness. It's not just the fact that now there's whole genome sequencing cheap enough so you can combine each of these applications into a single lab test, but moreover, by building software first, you're appreciating genetics today for what it is, which is fundamentally a dry lab science, not a wet lab science.
Small parenthesis, guys. Jaeun, do we have TerraCaps hats? Yes. Can you give to everyone?
That's nice.
Guys, we're ready, you see. So there is this secret running around in the valley that you're not hearing in other places, which is the very wealthy usually do embryo selection, and they do embryo selection based on the DNA. So they would choose based on intelligence. They would choose based on specific characteristics. And this is something you've been hearing for the last 6 months in the valley and so on. And I was actually surprised to learn about the new product from Nucleus, which is the Nucleus Embryo, that you are allowing folks to do this en masse. So you are allowing everyone to choose and select embryos. So first of all, how did you think of the idea to get this product out?
So it's interesting with Nucleus Embryo, and just to give people some context here, people who undergo IVF, they get a couple usually viable embryos, right? Embryo is the beginning of humans, right? We all come from an embryo. We all come from a sperm and an egg from, mom and dad. And basically you have a couple embryos, and usually today people will implant one of these embryos randomly. So let's say you have 2 or 3 embryos. You would say, oh, I don't really know what the difference between they are. I'm just going to pick it randomly. And the beauty of a thing like Nucleus Embryo is that now we give you information on each of the embryos so you can see everything from its height to, disease risk. But before I talk more about Nucleus Embryo, let me take a step back and sort of connect your question to what I was just saying, which is the fact that one time, and this is a crazy story, but one time I was, sitting in my office, and I get an email from someone, and the email says, hey, I have 10 DNA files. Because again, remember, DNA now is just a string, right? I have 10 DNA files. Can you analyze it for me? And of course, you're the founder CEO of a genetics company. You think to yourself, someone can only have 1 DNA file, right? Like, that doesn't really make sense. Why do you have 10 DNA files? And he says, oh, there are 10 DNA files because they're embryos. Can you analyze them for me? And it's actually a great lesson, and it's kind of a classic startup thing where, I really believe, again, on this application layer, this idea that, like, it doesn't matter where the DNA, that DNA comes from. Like, fundamentally, the models that you use to analyze embryos, they come from adults, obviously, right? Because you need to basically see, hey, if these adults have this specific phenotype, which genetic markers are disproportionately associated. And so I remember what we did was, and this is, again, a great lesson for startups in general, which is we served this customer. We gave him some disease analyses specifically. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if you're building an application layer for DNA, if you look at a DNA file of an embryo and a DNA file of an adult, they're identical. And so I always knew from the very beginning, on the first page of the first notebook I wrote, I always knew that I was going to build a platform that did something called generational health. This idea that you don't just build, like, genetic testing is the only lab test that doesn't just help you live longer and healthier, but also helps you have healthy children. Right? Because, like, every single person, when you're having children, you're at risk of passing down some serious condition. And so you should do genetic testing to flag that. And I think the embryo analysis was sort of a kind of a further continuation of doing something I've always wanted to do, which I've always wanted to go full stack. I've always wanted to go from adults to embryos and then to birth and do the kind of testing. And so this sort of came to me, this opportunity, and I actually shelved it for a while because it's not the thing I wanted to focus on. I wanted to focus on adult testing. Eventually, once we got our adult testing up and ready, I kept getting emails from different, I have to say, wealthy individuals and saying, hey, here are my embryo files. Can you analyze them? And I thought to myself, to your point, I said, I'm a big believer that everyone anywhere should have access to the frontier technology to help themselves live longer and healthier, and also help their children live the best possible life. And so it sort of came together. And one thing about this too is I have to give a shout out to our partners, Genomic Prediction, because we obviously don't do the testing of the embryos, so we need an embryo testing partner. And so we started talking to Genomic Prediction about it, and then one thing led to another, and suddenly we have the testing layer done. We have the first, to my knowledge, public embryonic selection platform that's ever existed. And it's a great example for people who are building the audience to think, what is the thing maybe that actually is just as compelling, if not even more compelling than the thing I'm building right now? For us, it's a little bit different because, we're building application layers. So we accept DNA files so we can do any instantiation. But I do think you should always kind of have this like little ear for like these little signals, right? If someone's emailing you saying, hey, can you do this thing for me? The number of startup stories of, people being like, wait, that thing's actually even more interesting than the thing that we're doing. For us, again, it's a little bit different because adult DNA testing is never going away. Like, that's going to be a very valuable business. Embryos will be very valuable business. And I actually argue that they're super interconnected. But still, that listening to the quiet drum of the market, I think, is very, very important. And so we built the first, in a couple months, actually, we pulled the team together. We got the embryo selection platform up, and we are bringing to people what used to be in the hush hush of Silicon Valley. And one of the things that really, really annoys me is that, people will do IVF, and then they'll go to these like really kind of private, confidential, hidden like testing companies, and they'll give these like backdoor analyses to them. That's not right. Anyone, anywhere should have access to this technology to basically have their kid thrive, right? And so what we've done is we kind of broke the narrative ice, I think. We just said, hey, we think you as the couple has the right to pick an embryo that's smarter, that's taller, maybe that even has an eye color that you want, that has lower breast cancer diseases, lower diabetes disease risk. And this technology should not just exist in the ivory tower. It should not exist in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. It should exist publicly, openly, transparently, and for every single person in the world who's doing IVF for now to use. That's our vision.
How many of you guys have Twitter here? Okay, if you head to the Nucleus page right now and you see their last announcement, it was one of the most controversial posts, and it drew a lot of interest, a lot of comments. Can you speak to us about this? It was a super controversial topic, apparently. So how did you deal with it?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because sometimes I go on Google and then I see a new article written about it. And what I always find interesting is that I think you're onto something when two people write directly opposite stories about it. The range, the ideological range of stories about nucleus embryo, it spanned from things like, calling me all sorts of names, maybe pissing off the Christian right a little bit, to this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and this is the singular most transformative technology next to AGI, which I think is probably true. And those are things that are actually complementary as well. And so for me, it's weird because the hardest thing I think that I've found is that one thing that's interesting is, in a way, like I always like to think about things. I have a theory about founders and about Silicon Valley and about like tech stars, which is like the thing that people do at the meta scale when they have leverage that they do nationally is also the thing that they do when they're alone in the bedroom. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that, like, if you think about it, when I go way back into the beginning of my journey, when I was in the bedroom, there was a lot of very intense psychological abuse. It was sort of a weird, you start like losing touch with the reality a little bit because, everyone basically, everyone you love, everyone you trust is telling you that you shouldn't be doing this. And it's the sort of thing that is only told after the fact, which always weakens it a little bit, right? Someone always tells this after they've made it to some extent, which I don't think we've made it, but to some extent. And so people always do this kind of post-rationalization justification of like, oh, well, it's so hard, but now look where I am. But I would employ people to go back, you're in the bedroom, it's isolating. The amount of kind of conviction you have to just to keep going, just one step at a time, one step at a time, one step at a time, in a very real sense. It's the same skill set now when I go online and I see someone write absolutely something horrible, something I wouldn't say about, my worst enemy, about me, my work, about Nucleus. And in the same way, the same sort of fortitude, the same sort of concentration, the step-by-step faith in the work that I'm doing, it pulled me out of the bedroom, and it's going to pull this technology forward as well. That's kind of how I think about how I deal with some of the blowback. I think I tell the company internally, you have to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And at that point, the only person that's going to judge you is God. There's really no one else. If that's true, if the sincerity of intent is there and you really try to do great work, what does it matter what anyone says?
And in the last discussion we had, and I'm pretty confident about that. The way that Nucleus portrays the story is one of the best storytelling machines in the world. If you'd like, in the last discussion we had, you mentioned that if you are a founder, you are competing with Mr. Beast. Can you elaborate on that? Yeah,
so I told Kyriakos, as I said, if you're a founder today, you're competing with Mr. Beast. And, One time one of our investors, he said to me, the only thing that matters for a consumer startup is eyes and ears. Some of our former interns might take this too far. Shout out to my man Roy Lee from Cluely. But maybe people didn't get that joke as much as I thought they would. But I think when you think about eyes and ears, it's an interesting point because now we're in a world where anyone can put their video camera on themselves and they can tell a compelling story. That's pretty amazing. I think it's like almost like, storytelling and narrative is like democratized. Like you don't have to rely on the Wall Street Journal. You don't have to rely on the New York Times to tell your story. You as a founder, and it's funny because I see on Twitter now so many YC founders, shout out to YC founders, they're all like making a video now. Like it's actually pretty fun. It's like a new trend. Like I feel like someone hasn't written like the thought piece yet on how like every founder's like, hi, my name is, Jimmy, and I'm building the AI for Cursor. And you're like, what the fuck? What does that even mean? And so I think as a founder, you have to remember that you control your narrative. And if you don't like what people are saying about your product, about your company, about you, the good thing is you can tell your own story. And I think what often you find is when you listen to founders, generally, not always, but generally they're good people trying to do good work. And I think that is something that I find very powerful with our marketing, which is, we tell our story. And we're very proud to tell our story. And we know sometimes our story might be taken by a whole host of people in various different ways. But I think as a founder, you got to get I was saying this to someone recently, which is like maybe the first hire, there's different theories on like, what should the first hire of a startup be? Maybe the first hire next to the founder is like a videographer, right? Because as much as you're fighting with technology, and you are always fighting to some extent with technology, you're also fighting with narrative. You're fighting with marketing. And if you view marketing and narrative and storytelling as much as alpha, as technical alpha, and you're sort of seeing the rise of this too with people like Lulu, for example, right? Where Silicon Valley is sort of embracing this idea of communications as another tool alongside technology to win, basically. And I actually think that's a really good thing because I think the best businesses will combine some sort of technological alpha with some sort of distribution/marketing alpha. And if you can get those both things right, and notice I said both, not just the technical, but also the marketing, I think you're going to build a very, very formidable business. I just don't see a world where you don't.
And since everyone is going to YC, I think you kind of have a beef with the YC way. So let's speak a bit about the lean startup versus the moonshot. How are you thinking about these things and how should people think about it?
Oh, boy. There's a funny tweet from Sam Altman at some point. He might have deleted it. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. But he was like, I did startups wrong because, I did OpenAI and I raised $10 billion and I should have just done that. Like, what was I doing? Starting up my location, social media app. And people started arguing over it because it get to this point of like where the lean startup method, et cetera, et cetera. I think as a general rule, this is a great example where there's like two models of the world. And in fact, both models are correct. Someone just hasn't built an integrated model. You see this all the time in physics and also in genetics as well. And so there's I think if you're a founder starting out, scrappiness is king. Right? Like you need to be very scrappy. You have no money. You have no network. Like, let's not play games. You're not going to go raise $10 billion to start your nonprofit AI arm. I mean, it's just not going to happen, right? You're not Sam Altman. And so, even Sam Altman, right? He started off kind of lower stakes. Elon did too. They started off lower stakes. And so I think the number one thing is to get started. Number one thing, get started. You don't need a lot of capital to get started. You don't need much to get started. Like, again, sometimes I like to think of Silicon Valley as like, imagine, the Simpsons movie where there's like that dome that like covers, right? Like that glass dome. I think of it as like this glass dome where there's like 3 or maybe 4 entry points into the dome. It's like, it's very clear. There's like, there's YC, there's Z fellows, maybe if you're lucky, the Teal Fellowship, and then maybe like a couple angel investors, right? There's only a couple like 4 ways into Silicon Valley, but that's how you get started. And it's easy. I would argue it's accessible for anyone who really, really wants it. And so when you think from that perspective, you start realizing, well, get your thing started, scale it up, make some money, and then maybe you go for the moonshot. I think it depends. Like I argue this sometimes with my founder buddies, which is like, how much should you go for the moonshot? How much should you go for the lean startup? How much should you go for the thing that you think is going to just like make some money, that's going to like have a positive impact in the world, that's going to help your customers first and foremost, versus how much should you go for the OpenAIs of the world? I think Nucleus is unique because I had a very, very strong, compelling vision of what I wanted my kind of moonshot to be. And also with Nucleus, there was a very specific plan to start software native because it was cheaper, right? And so I think there's a world where if you feel sufficiently compelled on your moonshot, you almost don't even need to hear the advice to go do it. You're going to go do it. And if you don't have that, I do think building in a more sort of scrappy, customer obsessed fashion is sensible as you kind of learn the ropes before going to build your open AI. I mean, that's what literally even Elon to Sam to all of them, that's what they do. So that's kind of the way I think about it. And I realize that as I'm talking right now, I'm sort of saying opposite things because again, these things are both correct.
From the genetic standpoint, if say someone does the test and they realize that they have a really bad disease, but they cannot do anything about it, what would you recommend to them?
Great question. So I put the next steps once you get a genetic test into kind of 4 or 5 main buckets. So let's start with the first one. The first one is what I call urgent and actionable. So my cousin, for example, when she passed away, she had a condition called long QT. Long QT is interesting because there's no actual phenotype. Like you can't tell someone has it until they're dead. But you can give someone something called a beta blocker, which is a drug that basically reduces the risk 10x of dying. And so that's a great example of where you identify a genetic marker, and we actually do identify long QT patients, scarily enough, and they tend to be pretty young. And you can give someone a very specific targeted impacts to basically mitigate their risk. There's another group which I call the Angelina Jolie bucket. These are what I call important and actionable, like breast cancer, for example, heart disease, colorectal cancer. There's a bunch of them. These are conditions where if you have like a BRCA variant, for example, dramatically increase the risk for breast cancer, you can get a double mastectomy to basically reduce your risk of breast cancer negligible, or you can get earlier, more aggressive screening for breast cancer, right? So that's an example of something where you're going to shift the kind of medical intervention depending on the genetics. Another good example is heart disease. Often people will have high LDL levels or high cholesterol levels, and the doctor will tell them, oh, you had great risk for heart disease, but actually you're not. It depends on your genetics as well, right? My cousin and I, we both have the same high cholesterol, but my genetics is actually below average. Her genetics is 99 percentile. So for her, taking like a statin, for example, is like a requirement. Like she literally through exercise and working out won't ever be able to bring down her cholesterol. Through me, I should probably, get some more sleep, right? So that's another great example. Another application of genetics is like if you're a carrier for a rare genetic disease, like I'm a carrier for cystic fibrosis, that doesn't impact my health, but could impact my future child's health. That's why we launched genetic matching. So you can basically see if you and your partner are a match or not. You might wonder, okay, I'm in love with this guy, this girl, we're not a match, what do we do? Well, you can actually then do IVF and nucleus embryo to basically screen out the disease and basically stop that disease from being passed down to your child, which I think is awesome. Another application, which I personally is my favorite, is we find that founders tend to be a high genetic risk for schizophrenia. They're cracked as fuck. And so my genetic risk is like 99 percentile. Crazy, right? And so I find that, for me, I've never done any drugs, never done any psychedelics specifically, but there's a reason why if you give the, two people the same drug, one gets one shotted, one doesn't, it's because of genetics, right? So very actionable utility. Shout out to all the founders who are high schizo risk. And to be clear, you can be high schizo risk, high genetic risk for schizophrenia, but still really low overall chances of getting the condition, right? So general population for schizophrenia is like 0.5%. You can maybe go up to like 1.52%. So it's dramatically higher, but still low. But one more point here that's actually interesting, tangent, is the extreme enough version of any trait is a disease. So take, for example, something like height. If you go to extreme one end where you're so sufficiently tall, you have Marfan syndrome, which is a disease. The other end is dwarfism. IQ is the same thing. Like you can be mentally impaired on one end, but on the other end, you can have like some sort of super autism, right? So like the extreme enough version of anything is actually a disease. And that's actually why as a company at Nucleus, we don't really see a difference between diseases and traits, right? When people think about optimization in the human longevity context, they don't just say, I don't want Alzheimer's. They say, I don't want Alzheimer's and I want to be thriving. I want to be jacked. I want to be strong. I want to be ripped. I want to be, mentally all the way there, right? So that's why diseases and traits are actually much more inextricable than the general model people have of these phenotypes. There's one more bucket that I can't remember because I went on this tangent, but there's one more application. Oh, something like Alzheimer's. Someone might say, oh, Alzheimer's, what do I do if I have high genetic risk for Alzheimer's? There's nothing can I do? Well, I actually strongly disagree with that because there might not be a cure today or a preventive measure today for Alzheimer's, but that's definitely not going to be true tomorrow. Right. And if you don't know you have the genetic risk, you basically are flying blind. You're in a plane and you can't even see outside. Because what happens is when you find out you have a genetic risk for Alzheimer's, you're going to start keeping abreast of the research, start understanding all the different preventive measures you can do. You can make sure you don't pass that disease down to your children, right? So there's a whole host of activities that you can get from just knowing your genome.
For some context, if you go to Nucleus page, you're going to see that there is a dating profile with Kian. So how did that go?
We go on genetic dates. It's lit. We actually released a video recently of me and someone in SF going on a date. It was very interesting. Let's just say that. We went on to a longevity spa, and basically the idea was at the end of the date, we were going to see if we're a genetic match. And I just want to be very clear with this, which is if you love somebody and you do carrier screening with Nucleus, you see if you're a genetic match. If you're not a genetic match, obviously you're not going to break up. You would do IVF to basically make sure you don't pass down that disease to your child, right? So this is very much about empowerment, right? We're not here breaking up relationships. But to be clear, if you've just met someone, I usually go, where'd you go to school? What do you do? And, have you done Nucleus? What? And then, you can see basically, hey, maybe in our case, me and the person I went on the date with, her name's Aurora, shout out to Aurora, we were unfortunately not a genetic match. And so, we had no plans of dating. It was for a video, but I mean, if I was me, I probably wouldn't go on another date, honestly. Just because, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's your choice. I think you should know. I mean, people will stalk, you'll stalk your girls, you stalk your mans, Instagram, you look at their family, look at their parents, you look at everything about them, right? I mean, why not also look at the DNA? Like, it just makes sense. Like, I don't know. Like, it's like literally, I think it's gonna be very, in fact, in some communities, they do this. You look at the Ashkenazi Jewish community, for example, everyone's screened. There's no, I mean, if you can, make it such that your child is not at risk for a debilitating disease, and you can do that by taking a swab test. I mean, I think it's just like a pretty common sense measure to take. And then I think there's two contexts. And in the dating context, which I talked about, and then when you actually got to have kids, if you're doing IVF or not, it obviously helps empower couples to make sure they can have healthy children. So honestly, one of the things I think about Nucleus is like, I don't want what happened to my cousin to have to happen to anyone. Right? If my uncle, my aunt had access to technology, my cousin could still be alive. So,
if schizophrenia is closely related with intelligence, how do you choose?
It's funny because I was on this is good. We're asking the good questions. I was on a podcast recently with Ashley Vance. This is not released yet, so I can't talk too much about it. But he sort of asked me this question. So I'll give a sneak peek of my answer, which is that, people often think that, I'm going to pick for one thing. And it's like a silver bullet. It's like, I'm going to make my kid super smart and super strong. And the reality is that, have you ever played one of those like FIFA My Player, or one of those like character building games where it's like, you can only give them so much strength, right? Without them losing agility. They can only be smart or athletic. Like, that's true. There's something actually fundamentally true about that, right? Like, at some point, if you want your kid to be like a cracked person, yeah, you got to give them some extra risk of schizophrenia. And I think you're not really supposed to say that, but it's true. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that society's going to have to think about as they make trade-offs. And, okay, what do I want to select for? What do I not want to select for? Right? And again, some geneticists would disagree with me here. They would bring up statistical points to say, okay, maybe each of the phenotypes are actually more disjoint than we think, and that you could actually optimize for one without the other. But generally speaking, what I've seen intuitively, one of my theories about science is you don't need statistics. You don't need scientific theories to show what's already intuitively obvious to the eyes. And let me tell you what's intuitively obvious to the eyes. If you look at height, for example, height is very genetic. Everybody knows that. You don't need to do a twin study to know that height is very genetic. Extroversion, personality, dramatically less so, right? You don't need, again, a genetics degree to know that extroversion is less genetic. And I'm taking this logic to the extreme here. Well, you don't need a genetics degree to know, people who are a little bit crazy tend to be sometimes really exceptional high performers. That's true, right? There's the old quib about madness and genius converging. I think that's true not just phenotypically at the level that you can observe, but also true genetically. And when you think about it from that perspective, I think it actually really undercuts a lot of the arguments against embryonic selection, because there is no right and wrong. There is no better and worse. It is what the parents want in their own value judgments and frameworks. And so from that perspective, you start realizing different couples will pick for different things. Like, one of my favorite examples of this is one of our members of our scientific advisory board. He spoke about this couple who is deaf and that they want to have a deaf child. That's their right. It's not for me It's not for the government. It's not for anyone to say whether the parent in their own sovereignty and own liberty want to have a child that is deaf. They have the right to do that. In other words, couples and parents will pick different things. And that's why this technology is fundamentally about empowering the couple. It is not about telling people what they should pick or shouldn't pick. It is giving couples information to then let them pick on their value frameworks and value judgments. And here's the kicker. Parents will pick off different things. They don't all want their kid to be the same thing. There's a weird assumption that everyone will want their kid to be a specific way. It's simply not true, right? It's funny because on the Ashley Vance pod, I said, I might pick my kid to be a little bit more schizophrenic. And Ashley Vance is like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Right? That's fine. That's a disagreement. That's fine, right? Like that's like people have different frameworks. I think that's a beautiful thing, actually. That's why you get, such a huge, diversity of population where everyone is basically picking for what they want. And people can be experts and amazing and follow their bliss in whatever their specific craft is.
Is it true that I have to choose in between intelligence and strength and muscle?
No, actually, it's not. That specific one, you could probably have a jacked, smart baby. I mean, look at you, Kyriakos.
I would choose back to apes, to be honest.
You would choose what?
Back to apes.
Apes? What do you mean?
More muscular, less smart.
There you go. See, he would want himself to be dumber. His choice.
Assuming there is embryo selection through nucleus for everyone, what happens in 100 years?
Oh, pontificating in the next 100 years of genetics. Fun. A lot of things. Okay, so what's going to happen is sequencing, analyzing, and engineering DNA is going to converge, and it's going to create a company that is probably as consequential as the largest AGI company. What do I mean by that? So look what's happening right now in the context of human reproduction, okay? There's multiple independent trends that are all converging. One, the cost of reading a human genome is becoming negligible. In other words, producing a DNA of an embryo or a human is going to cost nothing. Okay, so we know it's going to be ubiquitous. We know everyone's going to do it. That's one. Two, IVF is becoming much cheaper, much less invasive. Today, IVF is, hard. It is really painful, really emotional for the woman especially. And so how do you think about maybe taking a stem cell, right? And then actually taking that stem cell to form an egg or a sperm, right? And so it's going to become much less invasive and much cheaper. So now you have whole genome sequencing is becoming basically negligible. IVF is becoming basically mass accessible. What else is going on? Well, you can see, and there are startups coming out. I won't expose them, but there are startups coming out that are going to be announcing the artificial womb. Wow. Think about this stack that's forming. IVF is becoming cheap. Whole genome sequencing is becoming cheap. You're going to have an artificial womb that's coming out. And then also what's happening? We can't just read DNA and analyze DNA. We can also engineer it with CRISPR. Suddenly, you have the ability to sequence any embryo, conduct reproduction entirely, in vitro, not human body related, like entirely in the lab, basically. And you have the ability to engineer DNA cheaply, accessibly. So you can imagine a world where anyone, everywhere, can access the ability to basically genetically engineer to their wishes, to their choice, their children. And that is going to be technology that's cheap. It's going to be technology that's ubiquitous, and it's going to be available to everyone. And that's really important, right? Sometimes when I say this, people say, oh, it's only going to be for the rich. And I say to them, well, if you look at it, a 15-year-old, a college student, has the same iPhone as a billionaire. The ethos of Silicon Valley is to bring down the cost of these things such that anyone, anywhere can basically get access to the frontier of this new, what I call reproductive stack forming, from sequencing, analyzing, to then engineering DNA. And that's going to combine with AI. Because before you can actually engineer anything, you first have to understand, what can I engineer, right? You can have the best engineering device in the world, and you can go into your 1,000-page book and you could change any letter, right? But to do that, you need to understand, what does a letter actually do? And to understand that, what you have to do is you have to basically have a large human whole genome database that is mapped with phenotypic data. What do I mean by here? So to understand the genome, you have to first read the genome and then basically associate it with different diseases and traits, right? And so if you think about the largest whole genome database today, it's only 500,000 people. 500,000 people? Why? Because it was so expensive, as I mentioned, to read the entirety of someone's DNA is just now cheap enough that we need to build databases of billions of people. What happens when you build databases of billions of people? Well, you start understanding the genome much more precisely. Because we literally, for most of human history, could not have understood the DNA. Now we can. Then you're going to take those insights and actually be able to combine it with a gene editing device like CRISPR to make targeted edits. And then if you see the world where IVF is ubiquitous, cheap, and there's also an artificial womb, suddenly you can actually start making sure anyone, anywhere can access the frontier of genetic technology to basically eliminate preventable diseases, right? Genetic diseases will be an archaic thing. It'd be like someone dying of bacterial infection. There are still tens of millions of babies born with severe genetic conditions. I mean, that's crazy to think about. You're going to dramatically reduce the incidence of chronic disease. So you can do something called multiplex engineering, which is basically mass engineering many sites on the human genome, dramatically bring down, you can basically almost genetically bring down things like, breast cancer, heart disease, just from that, embryonic level. And also parents can have the right to make their kid however they want to make their kid. And those enhancements are going to be available to everyone. They're going to be ubiquitous, and it's going to be cheap.
Okay, guys, a raise of hands. How many of you have questions? Okay, it's 5 people. Anyone more? Okay.
Thanks for the talk. I just had a quick question. You mentioned this idea of the trade-off between different characteristics. What trade-off do you think is optimal that you would choose for your child?
I mean, I honestly don't really think it matters what I think is important. I mentioned earlier that I would probably pick my child to be slightly more schizophrenic disposition on average. But to me, it's not so much what I think, it's what the couple wants. Like, what does it matter what I think? I think it's up to the couple to decide how they want to pick their baby. It's their reproductive choice. It's not mine.
But do you think like one leans more towards intelligence versus, do you think one leans more towards intelligence or being like a founder, for example? Are there certain traits that someone could have?
Well, it's interesting because I would argue if you're sufficiently intelligent, you're actually a bad founder. Could argue about that, right? But I think that's true. I mean, Kyriakos made a joke about him being stronger and taking off a couple IQ points. I think there's a world where people realize that a lot of these things are not a silver bullet. So like you don't want to, like sometimes, for example, if you see that, let's say intelligence is correlated with autism, right? Like some parent might say, I don't want to take that chance. I don't want my kid to be super autistic, but have IQ of 200, right? That's not possible today, to be clear. But I'm just saying, like, these things are a lot more inextricable than people imagine. There is no silver bullet. It is up to the value frameworks. And often, honestly, people will pick their kids like how they are. Right? I gave the deaf couple example, right? Parents are deaf. They want the kids to be deaf. I said my kids, I want them to be more schizophrenic on average. Well, that's because I'm that way, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? So people end up just selecting for themselves. And actually, when people pick a partner too, they already do this. Right? You pick a partner, you want the partner to be a specific way. So your kids are actually implicitly a certain way. There's already is done at a population level at scale. Genetic selection just helps further optimize what's already existing.
Hey man, thanks for everything today. This is great. Quick question about scaling around some of the regulatory hurdles. What is the most difficult thing scaling the product that you have across not just America, but as you kind of look abroad and continuing to scale the technology? I have a wellness company and there's all sorts of regulatory issues that I'm having to jump through and solve. I'm just curious how you're thinking about solving all that.
Good question. So Nucleus is actually a clinical grade test. So we're approved by CMS. We're approved by the United States government to do clinical grade whole genome testing and analysis. So we're actually a laboratory. We're a dry laboratory. It's in North Carolina. And so we actually went the hard way and we got all the approvals to make sure that we can do this testing above board. Now, there are regulations that just don't exist for certain things. I mean, that's just true. And so, our perspective as a company is that we want to be compliant however possible. Like, we will comply with all regulations that exist. We want to do everything above board. We want to do everything transparently. We also want to, as a company, help form the regulations for a lot of the frontier use of genetic technology, right? Because people know this intuitively, which is technology will often move faster than regulations. And I think we need good regulations. We need the key stakeholders. You see this with AI happening now. It's going to happen in genetics too. You're going to see the key stakeholders go to Washington and talk to the government about the most sensible regulations. Because another thing with this sort of technology is it's inherently, when it comes to human reproduction, political. I mean, inherently, right? And so I think as a general rule, like, you don't want to just ban these things. It just doesn't make sense. You want to do everything above board. You want to do things under great ethical frameworks. You want to do things very thoughtfully. And I think it's the job of the private companies pushing this technology forward to work with the government to make sure that anyone has access to this, right? Because the second you try to repress something, it ends up being, in pockets, hidden, or internationally. That's bad. One, it's anyone has access to it. Two, there's very reasonable guardrails that people follow when they use it. And three, that, you don't try to block out any future competitors. I don't think regulatory capture is a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing in AI. I don't think it's a good thing in genetics either. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
Thanks so much for your time today. I just had a question in relation to when you were doing your research. You said, like, just after you dropped out of college, you also implied that you don't have a doctorate. During that 1 year when you were in your parents' bedroom, like, how did you go about that process, kind of going from college dropout to being on the forefront of this kind of technology? And what advice would you have for someone kind of repeating that process?
Amazing question. Okay. I'm going to answer this question inductively, and it might take me a little bit of time to get through everything. But so the first thing to appreciate is that anything in science, literally any science, whether it's physics, it's genetics, whether it's chemistry, whether it's AI, whether it's the transformer paper, science is inherently today public. Like, anyone could go and read a Nature paper on anything, and if they understood that Nature paper, they would understand the intellectual frontier. That's what I call it. They would understand the intellectual frontier. They would understand as much about that discipline as basically, let's say, the world's most renowned researcher. They may not have as good of an intuition per se, but they would intellectually understand that discipline as good as anyone else. So if I was looking to build another frontier company, right, let's, for example, give you an example. One thing I've toyed around with, and I'm not going to do this, don't worry, investors, but I've toyed around with starting like an artificial womb company because I think it's really interesting. And I've known nothing about artificial wombs, right? But I also know the way of accumulating knowledge. So I'm going to give you an example of what I would do, right? The first thing I would do is I would make the assumption, which is a good assumption, that there's some paper out there that is the foremost paper on how do you actually build an artificial womb. I imagine it's probably in the animal context. It's probably for a lamb, for example. And this is what I actually did for genetics. And I would find this paper, and I would literally speaking, and this is going to be much easier with AI now. It's a very time intensive process, but I would literally speaking read the beginning of the paper until a terminology or a sentence or idea or math or biology that I don't understand. Okay. And then when you start realizing with intellectual pursuits, what you start realizing with intellectual disciplines is it's like a tree, right? There's like a trunk, and then they form these different branches. And really what you're doing intuitively when you jump right to the Nature paper is you're going all the way to the end of the leaf. And now it's your job to almost like kind of recursively backtrack to the trunk. Right? Because what happens is you realize that all these things are inextricable. So when you go to that thing that doesn't make sense, like maybe you don't really know what a genetic marker is. Okay. So then you say, well, what's a genetic marker? And then you look into that and you say, well, there's this thing called a nucleotide, and you have to read a nucleotide. Well, one, what's a nucleotide? And two, how do you read it? Okay. And then I go back and say, okay, well, you have to do this thing called whole genome sequencing. Well, what's whole genome sequencing? I go back, okay, well, you need, DDNTPs, and you need fluorescence, and you need this massive machine. And wait a second, this massive machine is actually much cheaper than it was before. In other words, it's almost like if someone's like, how do I become an Olympic weightlifter? It's like, well, you go to the gym every day for 12 hours, right? I mean, hopefully you get a good trainer too. That's how you do it. Like, that's literally how you do it. Of course, the people who actually do that is so few and far between. But you can actually, going back to the artificial womb example, I'm almost certain that if one person in this room took that idea, and I know there's a couple startups coming doing it, but if one person in that room took that idea and you studied that idea every day for 12 hours and you filled in this like intellectual map where you basically go back down to the trunk go back to the Nature paper, keep reading until you don't understand something, and then go back and then rework and do this prior process. That's literally how Nucleus got started. Eventually you build this beautiful, I'd like to think of it as an intellectual castle, right? Where you have this beautiful foundation, and then suddenly you start adding in the windows, you start fleshing out the rooms, you start putting curtains up, and you start having kind of this beautiful acuity of your mental model of these things. And the model becomes so strong that what happens is that you could talk about another leaf, and because your trunk is so strong, you can then independently derive it. And so sometimes I used to wonder when I was in high school, how is it possible that certain biotech entrepreneurs, they start so many different frontier tech companies? It never made sense to me. It always seemed like the same group of people starting 100, tech companies, 100 biotech companies, especially, right? Like there's George Church, there's Snyder, for example. Then what I realized eventually is that a lot of the same underlying principles they use to then just make a bunch of logical leaps to build themselves up to the intellectual frontier. And then when you're at the intellectual frontier, you actually understand that the job of the enterprising individual is to productize it, right? If you fundamentally think about what you're doing is you're taking the foremost science, you're putting it in a product, right? And then you're scaling it. You're putting it with capital, you're putting it with people, right? You're making it something that's usable, and then you're scaling it. And that is another, in a way, it's another intellectual problem, right? Like when you look at a startup as just like, okay, the inputs are like capital and people, you can start actually as a serial founder just inducting that in so many different contexts. So now if you think about the most generalizable model ever for startups, it's you build the intellectual frontier model, right? Which you can induct across literally any discipline, just like this idea of like, hey, I want to be a weightlifter. I'm going to go, study 12 hours a day, this very specific discipline, maybe go a little bit crazy, but then I'll become literally 99.999 percentile in the world at it. And then you apply the inductive startup model, which is like, I need capital and people. That's how you can get founders like Elon who are able to start 10 different things because they're actually just doing the same thing. It's the same object, in other words, it's just different instantiation. That's how I would think about it.
Any last question?
There's a big conversation for nature versus nurture. And with that, what can Nucleus do and what can't Nucleus do in terms of like the IVF selection and all that?
Great question. Oh my God. I'm going to go on another rant. Okay. So earlier in this talk, I was talking about how basically intuitively speaking, people know things are different degrees genetic, right? So if I didn't know anything about genetics and I looked around, again, always trust your eyes and your ears, I would look and say, okay, well, height seems to be more genetic. That seems like a reasonable thing. And then I would say extroversion or different kind of personality things is probably less so genetic. Right? I'd probably intuitively guess that. And so what scientists do is they conduct studies where they basically will take twins and they try to derive to what extent a given phenotype is genetic. Okay, and then they get a certain percentage of the phenotype that they can attribute to genetics. So let's say height, for example. Height, scientists estimate is about 80% genetic. Intelligence, scientists estimate about 50% genetic. Extroversion or depression, let's say it's about 10% genetic. In other words, what you realize is that even if you could build the best possible genetic model in the world, there would still be error. But of course there would be error, right? If there wasn't error, DNA would be destiny, and there'd be absolutely no stochasticity. There'd be no free will, right? And this is the thing that I think is so interesting that gets so often misquoted, which is that, like, you can never look at someone's DNA and determine how exactly they're going to be because precisely for this fact that there's always for the phenotypes that you and I know, environmental influence, right? So if you do nucleus embryo and, let's say the height model explains about, of the 80%, you can basically explain about 50% of that 80%, right? Even if you could explain the 80% in the nucleus embryo, there's still going to be error, right? But people know this to be true, right? Obviously, you take someone and they have the same genetics and you feed one, you give one, water and home and everything. And, they're going to be much better off than if you basically deprive someone of food. They're going to obviously grow much less. There's always a environmental impact with everything. That is a feature of the platform. That is not a bug of the platform. There is no such thing as genetic determinism. And when people understand from this perspective, it rewires their mind as this, not as some evil deterministic Gattaca tool, but as something that's simply going to help parents, another tool in the toolkit to help their son or daughter be healthy. And then the rest is up to you. It's up to your free will. It's up to your sovereignty. It's up to your choice. I think that's a beautiful thing. And so whenever we provide analyses, we're always careful to say what analyses are better, what analyses are worse. But even more than that is we show the substantial error bars that exist, right? And when you show the error bars, this isn't something that's like a bad thing. Again, that's how nurture is, right? Ultimately, the IQ of your child, right? The height of your child, the different heart disease risk, a lot of that's going to matter on your life, your livelihood, how you nurture your child. And so DNA is not destiny, and I think it's important to embrace that as a genetics company, and we do. That's the answer. One more question. One more question. No. Okay, one more. Yeah, sure.
Hey, Kian. First of all, I love the tree model of just like understanding kind of any area. But could you touch a little bit more about the capital and labor kind of aspect of like scaling an idea? Like you have the intuition and you have like an idea you want to scale, but obviously, you didn't have the PhD or like the credibility behind it to really like get these investors on board and things like that. Could you kind of dive into like building that first MVP to really sell the idea?
Great question. Let me elaborate more on then in the bedroom. I think the core question that one day I'm going to maybe write more about, because I really want to give anyone insight into it, is like, how do you actually speaking go from a bedroom to like building a company? Because there's a big gap there, admittedly. And it's something that I've always struggled with communicating, because it's a very like involved and detailed process, and it was at the very, very beginning of Nucleus. And so it's the thing though that I think for founders it's most important, which is like, how do you take some sort of frontier thing and productize it? So let's go back to now this idea that there's this kind of intellectual frontier and you're building up your understanding to the intellectual frontier. As I mentioned, intellectualization is good, having that understanding is good, but investigativeness is fundamentally not enterprisingness, right? They're very different skill sets. So to productize something, to productize science, you need a team and you need capital. So one way of actually, interestingly enough, and this is actually really like, it doesn't need to be this way, but this is the way it is, which I think is awesome. Interestingly enough, when you actually seek and build the intellectual frontier, inextricably, you identify these scientists that are at the leading or bleeding edge of the intellectual frontier. In other words, you're finding your actual future employees. Think about that. So when you read that Nature paper, who wrote that Nature paper? There you go. Right? Like literally speaking, like, hey, that might be, and here's the thing. If you go to a scientist and you say, hey, join my startup and look at my bedroom, they're going to be like, fuck off. But here's what's interesting. This is the thing that's really interesting. The scientist might have a PhD student, right? The scientist might know someone. Or what I think is actually the greatest thing that happens is when you talk to the scientist, given that this is their investigative life work, and you don't always get lucky with this, but especially if it's something that's a little bit more applicable science, what you find is when you start talking to them about productizing it, it is such an unusual thing in academia for someone to actually come to a scientist and be like, I'm going to like work with you and like take this out of the lab and do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, L, M, N, and K things, and to make sure that this technology goes to everyone. That's like music to a good scientist's ears. And because they're not used to that, that's not how their brain is. And so for me, what I did is there was a scientist that was doing a lot of research on the frontiers of polygenic prediction. And I actually started emailing him to help answer a lot of my intellectual questions on genetics under a pseudonym. And what happened is we developed a relationship. And eventually I said to him, hey, I just raised some money. I actually told him that I was still a student at Penn because I actually wanted to go buy his academic project, which we did actually. And I put him on as an advisor. So notice how these things became inextricable. In doing the intellectual pursuit, you get a mind map of who the important players are. And then you do what is a Kian signature, which is you put them on the advisory board to then get them as an employee. Great tactic, because people won't join as an employee. But what you do is you say, hey, yeah, no problem. Here's a little bit of equity. Go on the advisory board, use their name, use their credibility, right? Keep punching up. Go back to them and say, look at this momentum. Look what we've built. Look what we're scaling fast. No scientist, when it's their baby, when it's their work, right? That scientist that's building the artificial womb that published that paper in Nature, right? Who wouldn't be like, fuck, like, I want to get in on this, right? This is my life's work. This kid really knows what he's talking about. I believe fully with this vision, right? I'm going to hop on board. So in a way, when you go through the intellectual, maze, you end up actually solving both problems in one go. But here's the thing. The goal now, and I'll close out the talk this way. The goal now isn't just to pick some random intellectual topic and to go really deep on that, because you're never going to make it. It's too hard. It's just too hard. It's too long. It's too technical. It's too mentally intensive. It's too lonely. But that's why it always starts with the most upstream thing, which is like, if I could do anything in the world, if I had all the money in the world, I didn't have to worry about anything in the world, what would I do? And what happens is, almost always for people, they say, I would do this thing. And then what happens is after they say that thing, they go, but, and then they list a whole bunch of bullshit. A to Z, my mom, my dad, my cousin, my brother, my friend, my teacher, my professor, my dog, my cat. Okay? You have to follow your bliss. There's a great quote that I love, which is, the best way to save yourself, the best way of saving the world is to begin by saving yourself, and then you can save the world. I really believe that to be true, right? Those who enlighten, enlighten. That's true. And so, from that perspective, even before you think about it's almost the wrong question to ask, like, what intellectual maze should I go down? It's almost a much better question, which is like, what is my bliss? And then if you follow that, then you can go to the maze, and then you can apply the theory of the maze, and then you can apply the theory of everything I described to you. But you have to get the most upstream thing right? Because the reality is not all of us are going to go build, the artificial womb. We're not going to go and weight lift for 12 hours a day because we actually don't really care about being a weightlifter, right? So solve the meta problem, and then eventually what happens to the world, from my experience, is the world will fall in place for you, right? Because if you go, something that's been always very surprising to me is like, when I talk about genetics now, in a weird way, because I've been doing it for so long, people now come to me to ask about like the frontier of genetics and genetic Tyson technology. Think about it. For me, it's kind of a weird thing because, I began in my bedroom, right? Like, it's like a weird, dissonance thing for me sometimes. So I'm like, that's weird. But I guess no one literally has spent such intense effort, such sincerity of effort, and such a productization such that in a very real extent, when you rise with your company and your idea, the world isn't a fixed way. It just kind of gets out of the way for you. It's a very, I don't know how to properly articulate this, but it's a very interesting thing. Like, you don't have to even worry about if something's in vogue or not, because by the nature of your curiosity, you make it in vogue. Thanks, guys.
What a shot.
Opening on too many tangents.
Mine is start. Yeah, I've got one more question for you.
Sure, bro.
Are you doing the cold plunge?
Yeah, if you want me to, I'll do it.
Yeah, let's go. All right.
Guys,
we're gonna be serving food on
Kian
the
is
left side.
going for the cold plunge. If you want to see him.
Woo! That's fucking gold.
Ask questions now. The speed round.
What are your questions?
You know ask questions?
10.
10 seconds.
10 seconds, good.
Where are you going?
I was gonna go a minute.
Okay, let's go. Breathe through it.
How do you feel?
I feel fucking fantastic. It's been a minute. Should I get out of here?
You can stay more.
Come on, give me a round of applause. Come on.
Crushed it.